it depends on where they are in their disease journey.
Mhm.
A lot of patients that I spoke with feel the urge to know more at the time of diagnosis.
Mhm.
And then over a period of time, they create their own mechanism of looking for and filtering out information, identifying sources, etc.
Hi, I'm Caitlin,
And I'm Clarinda,
and this is Not Just Patients.
a podcast where we break barriers to meaningful patient involvement in healthcare.
Thanks so much for tuning in. On this episode, our guest is Avishek Pal, who will be speaking to us about how patients can better access and contribute to medical publications.
Avishek is a microbiologist by training with 17 years of experience in the field of medical affairs and scientific communications, and was part of the patient-focused medicine development working group that developed the plain language summary how-to handbook. He was also part of the pan-industry stakeholder focus group, which contributed to the International Society for Medical Publication Professionals recommendations on developing plain language summaries of publications. In his current role in the Novartis Cell and Gene Global Medical Team, Avishek is leading their innovative above-country medical model for CAR-Ts alongside medical engagement strategy, which includes partnership with patient advocacy organizations. In parallel to his day job, Avishek is affiliated with the Institute for Biomedical Ethics at the University of Basel, investigating how medical research information in plain language may improve health literacy and autonomy in patients with chronic diseases. Abhishek, it's lovely to have you here.
No, thank you, Clarinda and Caitlin. It's a pleasure to be invited here, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion and conversations.
Yes, we are too. So there are two parts to this conversation, which is how can patients better access? So there's the access part, and then contribution, which is, I think, a fairly new but extremely promising development in publications where patients can be involved at the level and beyond the level of a researcher. So maybe we can just start with the basics. Would you say that patients in general are trying to access medical literature more these days?
I think it's a great question to start with. Throughout this conversation, I don't want to come across as speaking on behalf of patients. I think what I'm going to share is more about my experience that I've worked with them, heard from them,
Mhm.
and also the other stakeholders in this whole ecosystem. There is an increasing trend of patients trying to access medical information. I
Mhm.
think that's clear. However, it's not the case for everybody.
Mhm.
I think it depends a lot on what kind of disease they have. Their motivations and needs are very different, by stage of the disease, where they're located in the world, their own demographics, what kind of support they're receiving from their physician and the healthcare system in general. These all have a say in how they look for information or they feel the need to look for information. And also, not all patients actually want to know, especially in chronic diseases or progressive diseases which still don't have a cure.
Mhm.
I understand from some patients that they don't want to know more.
Mhm.
They don't want to attend sessions, for example, where they have an opportunity to meet other patients who might have a more advanced disease. They want to shut out that information because they feel they're doing fine at the moment and they're okay with it. Till they feel the need that something needs to change. So I think
Mhm.
sometimes we have this tendency to believe that patients want to know more. I think it's their choice. The other aspect is also the health literacy angle or the digital literacy angle.
Mhm.
The literacy doesn't automatically translate into health literacy. So just
Mhm.
because someone knows English doesn't mean they have high health literacy. So, what is their literacy level? Is it as basic as a functional literacy where they simply read, understand? Or is it more communicative where they want to seek and understand? And whereas is it critical? A classic example of critical health literacy would be the two of you who have not only tried to understand your own disease areas, understand the landscape, but also are becoming advocates in the community for others like yourselves who may not have the voice like you do. And you're trying to make that difference.
Mhm.
And again, I think we can't expect everybody or we can't force them to make these choices. So I think that's very important. So I would say it's increasing, but not everybody consciously wants to look for information.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's really spot on. And in this conversation, it shouldn't sound like we're forcing anyone to learn more or be more involved in their care than there should be. It's all about choice and whether people want to.
Mm-hmm.
And I also just wanted to touch quickly on what you said about health literacy and what you said about people equating literacy, so actual reading levels, to health literacy. I think is a really prominent issue. A lot of people talk about health literacy without necessarily understanding what that means. My understanding is that health literacy is basically about your ability to take that information, process it, and act on it. And it might be because you don't have access to information that you can understand, because maybe you don't have the education or the literacy skills, but it might also be that you've moved to another country and it's in a new language, or that you don't have access to the healthcare system, or you don't have the time or the money to be able to find that information. You don't know where to go. There are so many reasons. There might be social, cultural, religious, economic barriers to health information, and not just the information, but using that to actually impact your own care. So I think health literacy, the name of it can be confusing, but it's much wider than that.
Absolutely. And it's not like experts in health literacy also have a consistent definition of health literacy. And then again, the definition has evolved over the years. And sometimes it's not about lack of availability of information, it's about an overload, and then you don't know what to screen out.
Yeah.
So for those who do want to be able to access, for example, medical research or medical literature, why is it important for them to be able to do that?
I think what comes out very strongly, some of the interviews that I'm doing as part of my study, is depending on the nature of the disease, oftentimes patients or their care providers have to make decisions on their care or self-care, perhaps when they don't have access to the physician or cannot necessarily get to the clinic or ask somebody within the healthcare system. So they feel more comfortable making those decisions and building that autonomy in self-care if they're able to get more information, and they feel that that helps them make informed decisions. This also in some cases make them more confident to have conversations with their physicians and not leave it just to the physicians to make a decision about their healthcare. It helps them challenge, debate. It also helps them navigate the healthcare system, because each healthcare system is so complex. And each of us, whether we are a patient with chronic disease or someone who's healthy but has fallen sick, we have often faced this situation. So patients and their caregivers are understanding that it helps them to have that autonomy in order to get better healthcare. And this is also in a way good for the healthcare system, because when you have more informed patients, the waste, the cost, the outcomes all are optimized in a way that works better for the populations. I think these are some of the reasons where I feel like patients want to know, and then they trust the physicians more. Oftentimes we see all these critiques on social media and memes about Dr. Google, etc., etc. But actually, it helps physicians have a better conversation with more informed patients. And again, it's a choice. I'm a student of quantitative research and I've been trained more from that angle, right? But now, as part of my studies, I do a bit of qualitative and I'm understanding social constructs. And one of the things I realize, and this typically happens in the generation before us, for example, our parents or their parents, where they leave the decision to others, right? And I always thought that this was not about autonomy. But now I understand that this is also a choice, and it is a type of autonomy where you're going to count on others for you to make a decision. And in those cases, again, the family decides based on what they read up, what they discuss, and how they find information. So I think it's really important that patients and their families understand and get access to medical research.
Do you think that it could be a bit of a chicken and egg thing, that patients who say they don't want this information, for them it's because they don't have easy access, or even if they try, it's overwhelming, so they'd rather say I don't want this information? Or do you think that that's an inherent choice? And I can see it, because when I became a patient advocate, it became most obvious to me that I had to see my disease every day, which I had not seen in that way for years, but when I'm interacting with other patients who are worse off than me, I am more aware. And of course, it takes its toll. And so I can completely understand patients who just don't want to think of all the possibilities or have all the information. But do you also think that there might be patients who say, I wish I had more information, but they say they don't want it because it's just so overwhelming?
Absolutely. There are different phases to it. It depends on where they are in their disease journey.
Mhm.
A lot of patients that I spoke with feel the urge to know more at the time of diagnosis.
Mhm.
And then over a period of time, they create their own mechanism of looking for and filtering out information, identifying sources, etc.
Right.
And there are some patients who don't do it at all. But in those cases, what I realize is someone else is actually doing it for them.
Mm.
So it's either a spouse or a family member who's perhaps more savvy, who's perhaps a little bit detached from the situation, perhaps the emotional aspect of it,
Yeah.
and they are doing it. I think language, which Caitlin talked about, is a very important thing. When they seek information, they find it, but in a language that they are not comfortable with. I think that also discourages them to seek further information.
Yeah.
That is true.
Mhm. So, just following on from that, then, speaking to the overwhelm that we were talking about, and Google and having access to so many resources on the internet, where is it that patients can go to find accessible and reliable information?
This is also a question that I have investigated in my professional life
Mhm.
because we wanted to put out reliable, scientifically fair, balanced information through those channels, but I don't think there's a consistent channel per se.
Mhm.
And while I was speaking to a couple of patients over the last few weeks, I learned about other channels which we typically haven't encountered as traditional channels. For example, Reddit threads and subthreads.
Mm.
And they have by symptom, they have by subgroups, and they trust those sources.
Mhm.
So I think there are no validated sources. And also, I think when the developers who create plain language materials, sometimes we are speaking with each other in the community and we all feel that we have come a long way, which we have, but I'm not sure if we are also asking the same questions to the intended audience. And in fact, at the last ISMAP meeting, some of our colleagues in the UK from an agency partner patient organization, we did a small study in diabetes, trying to understand, do patients look up information in plain language? Do they know what plain language summaries are, etc.? And
Mm.
they had no clue. I'm sure they refer to those, but they don't call them that.
Interesting.
And we, I think, get caught up in the jargon and
Mhm.
No.
Mhm.
searchability, and perhaps it's not reaching the intended audience. So again, going back to my previous response, I think health literacy plays a key role on how patients are looking for information. Some patients actually nowadays read up research papers or take research papers to the physician and ask them to explain those to them. So they believe perhaps that published literature is more reliable, which in a lot of cases is.
Mhm.
But I think physicians still remain their primary and majority information source. If not the physician, then the caregiving team. Of course, a lot of them use Google Scholar. I see now more reliance on patient advocacy group websites that wasn't there perhaps in the past, and
Mhm.
because there's a lot of good quality and reliable independent material being made available by these groups.
Mhm.
I have heard from very, very few patients about them knowing about clinical trial registries and then going there to look for trials they can participate in, and then in turn realizing some of the studies have results there, and that's how they come across that.
Mhm.
So they look for information in those sources. The interesting piece is we assume again a lot of things. For example, Cochrane Library, years of plain language summaries are available actually for all their papers. But if you search in Google, it doesn't come up. And also patients naturally don't gravitate towards the PubMeds or the Cochrane libraries. That's not the common place they look at.
Mm.
So for them to make that judgment, I think most of them are not there yet.
Mhm.
And I think reliability takes a big hit when we are doing so much in terms of these days we talk about multi-channel and omni-channel engagements where we put out modular content intended for different audiences through different channels, right? And I was telling somebody, and I think I was very unpopular because I said, we have this study out, and then there's a press release, there's an abstract, there's a conference presentation, there's a paper, and then the paper and the abstract both have plain language summaries, and then we have a vodcast and a podcast, and then we do a social media campaign.
Mhm.
And then, of course, we put the trial summary there on the web. We have infographics, and it's all for the same study, right? So when someone's searching and they're perhaps searching for something that's only one component of the study, they get hit by maybe the first page of Google, which has everything related to this study, and then they just don't know where to go next. It's not necessarily a bad thing for those who are developing this. I think the intent is
Mhm.
in the right place, but I think it makes it difficult for patients to decide what what's reliable. Very few of them, and I think perhaps they are the ones who are getting to that critical level of health literacy where they say, I take everything with a pinch of salt. Even, for example, these Reddit threads, a lot of people put anecdotal information. I take those, but I always consult with my physician or someone I trust. But also, the weight they give to a fellow patient talking about something is perhaps slightly higher than a random social media post.
Thanks, Avishek. It's clear there are lots of channels that patients are using. Definitely adds to the overwhelm, like you said. I mean, the intent is to reach patients where they are, but it's burgeoning and causing even more confusion potentially. You did mention plain language summaries a couple of times. Maybe we could just define it for our listeners, because I know that it is a tool that the industry is looking at in a big way as something that's going to revolutionize this space.
Sure. The easiest way to put it is it's an easy to understand version of scientific research. And the format could be anything from text to an infographic, a visual format, maybe a simple video or a podcast. But the purpose is to not dumb down the science, but to present it in a very simple manner with a readability that perhaps a high school graduate can understand. And again, that level of readability is also debatable. But in general, the top priority is accessibility. So accessibility in terms of searchability and accessibility in terms of the content being simple enough for anybody to read, understand, and then find the answers they're looking for. The drug regulators also now have a mandate that the trials that are completed by a certain deadline, those need to have trial summaries posted on the registry. So those are also part of this. The central theme being easy to understand.
Yeah, that does make sense, because what I was thinking when you were speaking earlier, when we were talking about different reliable channels, the most accurate and reliable of everything you just said are those studies that are very stringently regulated. But it's also probably the least accessible from a patient perspective, because I'm going to be honest, I have a science degree. I read study papers and clinical papers and data a lot. I'm aware of it. I would never read one that was to do with my own condition, because firstly, it's not for patients. It's very scientific. And I don't think that a lot of studies actually take the patient perspective into consideration. It's not telling me this will make you better. It's telling me here are all the numbers that will change, here are all the outcomes, and here is a massive list of everything that could go wrong if you take this. So they're actually quite scary, and I don't think they provide a full picture. And I think, therefore, one of the other reasons why patients are going to Facebook groups or Reddit, like you mentioned earlier, because they want to hear from people who have experienced it and who they can relate to, and who say, yes, maybe you can get all these scary things, but actually, not only, I'm using CF as an example here because it's something I know, but not only has my lung function improved by a significance of whatever percent with a p-value of 0.05, it's the fact that I feel better and I can breathe and I don't have a cough anymore, and all these other things that aren't necessarily captured in the reliable scientific papers. So I think plain language summaries are a really nice way of making that reliable information more accessible and more relatable to patients. I don't know, do the plain language summaries give that so what piece? Or is that just a good way for people to say, okay, I understand what the studies are saying, but they would also need to supplement that with stories from other people or discuss with their doctor to say, what does this actually mean for me?
It's a great point. Again, the intent of creating these are spot on, that you want to make research data more accessible, easy to understand for patients who are traditionally not the intended audience for published literature. And of course, like we discussed, they don't go through PubMed or Cochrane to look for information. Plus, when they maybe get to a paper, it's not open access. So maybe they don't get access to even know what's happening. Oftentimes, the plain language is sitting within the text of the paper. And so that just beats the whole purpose. And also, I think more importantly, one thing to consider is the studies talk about perhaps 2 different treatment options, or maybe 3, or maybe sometimes it's just 1 if it's a single arm study. And the question I think the patient faces is, what do you exactly exactly mentioned is, so what? What does this mean for me?
Mm-hmm.
Does this mean that my physician should definitely now prescribe this for me?
Mm-hmm.
How does this work versus something that I'm already taking?
Mm-hmm.
In the whole landscape of treatment options available for me, is this the one for me?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe I am actually taking this medicine already. This is perhaps, say, a long-term follow-up or something else,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't see the side effects that I'm experiencing mentioned in this paper. So what does that mean for me?
Mm-hmm.
What do I need to do? So I think plain language summaries or plain language materials have the potential
Mm-hmm.
to actually address a lot of these questions. However, and I'm going to put a shameless plug on one of the papers that we just published
Mm-hmm.
on this, so which gives a landscape analysis of all the different types of plain language materials that are available and the trends that we see.
Mm-hmm.
I think the challenge there is perhaps it's not always generalizable. Also, for a patient, it's challenging to figure out how reliable the data is. We don't expect every patient to understand sample size and power of the study, all those technical terms.
Mm-hmm.
All those aspects, I think, definitely make it more intimidating
Mm-hmm.
for a patient to really trust and access this information, which is actually good information. And then again, of course, predominantly in English, which again brings up that barrier. And also
Mm-hmm.
the timing, right? I mean, the study, say, gets done maybe a year ago, and then it takes quite some time to actually publish the paper. And just because there's a paper doesn't mean the product is out in the market, or maybe it's not accessible in that particular country from where the patient is reading the paper. So
Mm-hmm.
there are so many different variables in terms of first seeing and finding information, then trying to figure out what it means for them, then to see is it even relevant and how can they use the
Mm-hmm.
information. So I think the plain language elements do help in these angles,
Mm-hmm.
but I think we need to harmonize the quality standards and
Mm-hmm.
harmonize how these are being developed by different stakeholders. There's some guidance available there, but I think they often say slightly different things, and it's an important aspect to see if you're targeting the same group of patients, do you really need to do it so differently based on the recommendations from different groups? So there's opportunity there, but I think we need to find a better way to do these things.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, and I don't think we have any tech giants listening to this podcast, but since you mentioned that there are years worth of plain language summaries on sites like Cochrane, and those are reliable.
Mm-hmm.
For our listeners, Cochrane is an organization that summarizes available research on a particular disease area. So it's like an aggregation of what many studies say, and then there are plain language summaries.
Mm-hmm.
So that's hugely useful, but patients are not typically going to look at Cochrane. And I wonder if these reliable, in quotes, channels are only visible on something like Google Scholar, which is used by academics. And should Google or regular mainstream search engines be indexing and retrieving those and putting a premium on their placement on the search results? It's way above what we can influence potentially, but it seems like a direction that we need to move in.
Yeah, two things come to mind on that. I think the indexing piece, so, me being me, I did write to Cochrane, and them being very nice, they decided to chat. And I actually showed them live on my screen,
Mhm.
and this was 2 years ago. They really wanted them to be accessible, and they assumed they are accessible. So it was a surprise that it wasn't. But I understand that they have a new team in place, and they are looking to index it so that it features somewhere on the first page of Google towards the top, where whoever is searching can actually get a link. And you know how Google and other algorithms work. Once you click on it, you will keep seeing it. In terms of how to make some of these more accessible on the part of search engine regulators, perhaps I think that's where they're coming up with this whole automation and AI and NLP is where they want to offer it as a service. So I don't know if this is going to be free.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have something for free, it's never really free. And also the quality comes into question. But
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some thought process. The other thing which I remember quite some time ago, at that time, we had folks from Future Science Group, which is now part of Taylor and Francis, and the Becker's publishers, and somebody from Envision Group and a few others. So all of them have kind of gone in different ways, but I think their common idea was, would it really help to have a PubMed-like engine for plain language materials?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a very attractive proposition. The only thing is we don't want that also to sit on the second page of Google when somebody searches resources for it. So as long as that itself becomes accessible, I think it could solve some of these challenges. And then if it's reliable and if it's publicized to the different stakeholders, maybe that's something that could work.
Yeah, I think it sounds like a great idea, I suppose. Just being a devil's advocate, you would still need to raise awareness of that somehow to send people there. I think unless it's a service that people are really aware of, a lot of people will still go straight to Google. What I'm trying to figure out is there a way for anyone Googling anything that's medical and saying, what does this mean for me, to come up with a site? For example, I'm based in the UK, and if I Google anything medical, actually the NHS site comes up usually on page 1. They then can link me to a page on it and give me suggestions about what does that mean for you, when should you see your doctor, when should you go to A&E. And I think that's really good, and that's aimed at patients and in plain language. That's probably not the case in every single country or region, but that's usually for acute pieces. Whereas if I want to learn more about chronic disease, especially one where there are maybe experimental treatments or lots of different treatments. I'm thinking of cancer in particular, where actually in some diseases there's quite a lot of different therapies available and different lines depending on your disease state and characteristics. So that's where I think people would more likely want to learn a bit more about the options available. So if that tool was available, that would be great, but someone would have to make the patient aware. If you want to look at the clinical trials, this is a site you could use.
Yeah, great points. And since you brought up cancer, we found that, again, materials are not available in the same volumes for all disease areas. That's also another challenge. And it's sometimes quite demotivating for patients. For example, we were surprised to see a lot more research on autism spectrum and ADHD in the recent years versus in oncology even. And the other thing which I heard from some patients is, after a few years from diagnosis, they look for very specific information. And I think most of the information is tailored towards those who are just being diagnosed. Okay. And there they get really frustrated because they're like, I know all of that. For example, I'm talking about a patient who has some sort of a cancer and is considering pregnancy, or somebody who is on medication for a chronic disease and has a life event that they're planning. What kind of precautions would they need? And I think that kind of information, organizations like the NHS, and I think CDC puts up something sometimes, or NIH puts up those things, or Mayo Clinic. The larger hospitals sometimes have the resources to make these things available. So I think that definitely is also another consideration. That is it enough to put out information on trials, or do we need to do more? And the other thing is, are we leading to more publication bias into plain language summary? If you look at it from those creating these, what is the motivating factor other than informing patients? The question is, are you doing it for all of the studies, or are you doing it for those studies which seem to have a positive outcome? And when you have a positive outcome, you obviously go absolutely crazy talking about it through all channels, and then you have plain language summary. So the chances of a study which is absolutely positive, meeting its primary endpoints, is more likely to be visible, accessible, and dominating the infodemic versus, say, a smaller study or a study which might have shown that a therapy doesn't work. So I think that also is something we need to take into consideration.
Would you define publication bias for our listeners?
Publication bias would be what we call a positive publication bias. So if there are 4 studies coming out, and imagine if there is no obligation to put in the same amount of effort in writing up a paper or presenting an abstract at a conference for all 4, the natural tendency is to prioritize the ones that have positive outcomes and then get to the others when you have the time, which oftentimes is either delayed or perhaps doesn't happen. It's much lesser now because there are FDA and EMA mandates which require that the trial has to be firstly registered, of course, but also then you have to have your primary data published in some form. So I think that's the bare minimum it happens, but there is no obligation unless it's a study in children to do that within a certain time frame. So best practices and good publication practices say you need to publish irrespective of outcomes, and you need to plan your publication before you see the results. But I think oftentimes when you have a lot of things happening, prioritization is definitely aimed at those studies. So obviously when you search for in the literature, the chances are that we see a lot more studies which have a positive outcome versus those which don't. And then that's what leads to publication bias. And then if you create materials based on those studies which are out in the literature, which means that you're in some way perhaps fueling further publication bias into some derivative materials like plain language summaries.
Yeah, and that to me sounds a little bit like it's an ethical problem, because if clinicians are making treatment decisions based on only the good data and only the good publications, and then also if patients are part of that decision making and try to inform themselves, they're only seeing one side of the story in some cases. Yeah, I can see how that could be problematic. You know, we were talking earlier about how reliable publications are, but that doesn't mean that they are also telling the whole story, unfortunately.
Yes, and positive publication bias thing, it's been there for some time now. And I think there are safeguards in place from the regulatory standpoint. There are safeguards from the reimbursement authorities and the payers in different countries. However, we invariably miss out reporting on studies. And that's why I think the Cochrane piece becomes quite important, because it's independent, because they do systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So essentially looking at data across different studies, and then they assess the quality of that study. And that's why you will see perhaps a lot of the Cochrane research gives you outcomes which are not saying positive or saying negative. And that's because, again, it goes back to the nature and quality of the research that's been done. But still, it gives a sense to those reading them that there are some studies which are positive, some which are not, but they can also understand what's the, I would say, risk benefit ratio of what they are seeing. And I think if not anything else, it gives them the confidence to discuss it with their physicians. Oftentimes, I've been told that patients feel that the physician knows best, so it's no point challenging them, or that they don't know enough in order to ask questions to the physicians. And I think that is something that can be elevated to a large degree through these plain language materials.
So I think that we've spoken quite a bit about challenges, but I'd also like to touch upon AI, because that's something you spoke about. I know that when ChatGPT came out, I started looking up things about my condition.
Me too.
And asking for simple answers to things. Then I realized that it hallucinates, and that was a big problem. I know that you've done a lot of research on that piece as well, just how reliable it is and what the way forward might be for generative AI.
Yeah, by no means an expert. So I'm cautiously optimistic, is what I'm going to say. And obviously, you have different versions of ChatGPT. Plus, I think there are different organizations which use that as a base, but then build their own, because, of course, they want to manage the data privacy concerns, etc. So I think there's been movement forward. I think people are working around the hallucinations. What goes in comes out. So I think there's a lot of bias that we inherently have in our source data sets, which are also going in there, which I think they're trying to work around. I think it's getting somewhere. I see more use of it, at least being tried out in creating drafts of plain language materials, in perhaps creating chatbots to respond to medical information and queries. I saw a couple of posts on LinkedIn actually where patient advocates themselves have tested it out, and they say AI for patients. So they don't even want somebody else to use AI and give the patient's answers. They advocate that those be created also with the patient as the primary audience in mind. So I think there's a lot of work going on there. And again, my thought is that we shouldn't give up on it. However, I think it's something that needs a consultation with the experts, the physicians, and also perhaps the patients. I've heard a lot of concerns from some patient advocates around the use of these for creating materials, because currently there's a lot of focus on patients themselves co-creating materials with those developers or being part of the process. And they fear that with the AI coming in, if the idea is to generate them exclusively through AI, then obviously this takes a backseat. I think one of the independent organizations, they did something absolutely unexpected. They released AI generated plain language summaries of 2,500 studies registered on a trial registry. And they, of course, had the disclaimer in red and bold at the very top. And it had a very mixed response. I mean, I felt that sometimes somebody needs to do something to move the field ahead. If you wait for perfection, I think we'll never go anywhere. So I think what they did was, it was free of charge. Everybody could access it. They had the disclaimers there, and they said, look, it's possible to do it. This is not the best way, but it's possible to do it. But of course, there were critics who felt it was not a responsible thing to do, to put so much information outside for patients without context, etc. Also, I think it it's also about conversational AI, right? So how you ask a question matters. And then is everybody trained to do it? Perhaps more tech guys are trained to do it. We are not. So again, it's a long way to go, honestly, but at least people are making efforts. And I think it's all in the right direction.
I agree with everything you're saying. And I think AI at the moment is an amazing tool, but if you know how to use it correctly, and it does need to be checked. So if you are creating materials or trying to write something, it does need someone else to make sure that it's, accurate and compliant and fair. And I guess then my question is, what about patients then who are just using AI to ask questions when it's not necessarily always reliable because it's not taking its information necessarily from reliable sources?
Absolutely. That's where I think for those who feel overwhelmed with Google and then try out AI, I'm hoping that they look at it with the same level of suspicion that they look at Google. So some of the patients I have spoken with said they never trust information coming from one source. Doesn't matter what source. They always look for more than one. And if not anything else, they ask a qualified person. And that's why I think it's important that the other stakeholders don't deny the presence or utility of AI, because that I think is going to mean that a section of the stakeholders are going to not enable it, not use it, or perhaps not advocate for it. But the other part, the patients might continue to, but never tell those stakeholders. And then that perhaps leads to more challenges in terms of misinformation. I recently saw a paper, I think they did a study in Switzerland among physicians asking them how they see their role in all of this. And they said they are open to it. They need just more time for themselves to understand those, get trained, learn about it, and then they guide their patients on that. So I think there's this openness there, but it's important that all stakeholders are bought into. It shouldn't be a tech giant rolling out something and then it creates a mess that nobody can clean up.
Totally agree.
So it's clear that there are barriers and there's a lot of work to be done, but I understand that there is a lot of work happening already in this space to make publications more accessible to patients. You could argue that it started with the Open Access Initiative 20 years ago or more, where there is an impetus at the baseline for research to not be paywalled, more easily accessible to anyone who is not a researcher. And it starts there, but what are some of the initiatives that are driving better accessibility and understanding of medical research for patients?
I think something or the other is happening every other day, and it's hard to keep track of how well they are doing and are they impactful. But every stakeholder is quite committed to this cause. So one thing that I have seen is patient advocacy groups taking a much more leadership role in this aspect. And then you have the patient advocacy groups within specific disease areas. And those patient advocacy groups are now more vocal. They are able to create their own derivative materials on medical information for their patients and their members. So I think it's a huge step forward. One thing that I think is related to the publications piece, but starts much, much earlier, is that now there's a genuine interest in involving patients in the research itself. So patients don't just come in at the time of the study or just come in towards the end just to review materials, but now patients are consciously invited to be part of study steering committees. They are invited to review protocols, provide input on endpoints and what kind of assessments and safety profiles, adverse events they would like them to look into, the quality of life aspect. So what that allows also to happen is the studies are getting more and more designed in a way that patients eventually will benefit from the kind of data that these studies are generating. I think that's definitely a positive trend. Other than that, there are a lot of these plain language organizations which take initiatives not only for patients but for public in general. Journal publishers, as you know, they're creating platforms and opportunities for plain language materials to be hosted alongside the papers, the abstracts. They're open access. Some of them have full-length plain language standalone paper that they talk about and share. There are a lot of physicians who have taken it upon them, who are subject matter experts, to actually do their podcasts and vodcasts, share every presentation that they do openly for patients to access and ask them questions.
Mhm.
We talked about clinical trial summaries. The sponsors also send out summaries in their thank you letters to the participants. Plus, also, I think organizations like UPATI and a few others, they are now training patient advocates, and these advocates will now go out to the community and then start off community level initiatives, encourage participation in research, and then patients then get fully embedded at different stages of a whole drug development process. And then it's no more patient centric. It's just they are there and it's a normal thing. So I think then that kind of has a big impact in terms of how the literature coming out of that research is tuned to the needs of the patient. So I think these are the few I would say. And again, in terms of reliability of online material, I think in the UK, Caitlin, you have the PIFTIC, which I
Mhm.
found fascinating, how they're certifying websites, etc. And during my research, I also found out there are organizations like Discern and others who actually have checklists and mechanisms which people could use,
Mhm.
mainly for researchers. But still, there are some small elements which someone can check when they are looking at online content to really see whether they can be trusted. These initiatives actually go a long way in ensuring that things are reliable, the literature is available, accessible. Of course, I mean, there's a lot more to be done, but it's a good stage that we are at.
Yeah, I think that's all really interesting and actually leads on quite nicely to the next topic we wanted to talk about, which is more about patients being involved in research and actually being authors on clinical research as well. I wondered, just from that perspective, if we're talking about publications in medical journals, what is that traditional publication process, and why up to this point has it been not possible or difficult for patients to be authors on those papers?
I think the typical process is quite rigorous,
Mm.
quite iterative. It takes
Mhm.
quite some time. There are a lot of administrative steps. There are a lot of stakeholders involved. So it is in no way a simple process to get a publication out of research. And perhaps that could be sometimes daunting for patients. But more importantly, I think we typically comply with the ICMJE authorship criteria, which I think it was a huge step forward in terms of ensuring that anybody who's contributed to research is considered for authorship.
Mhm.
But what it also does is, I think when it was formulated, those were based on more an academic setting or a research setting. And if the way they are interpreted historically, if they are going to be continued to be interpreted in the future, then I think patients may not actually be able to meet the four requirements that the criteria outline. So I think that also oftentimes discourages other stakeholders from involving patients at the time of publication. And also the other thought is it too late in the process if the patient has not been involved at earlier milestones?
Mhm.
And that's where, going back to my previous conversation, if they have been part of the study steering committee, if they have been part of any of the protocol development stages, I think then they do meet the ICMJ authorship criteria in terms of substantial contribution, in terms of
Mhm.
reviewing materials, approving them, and understanding their responsibility as an author in terms of standing by the data in public. So all of those aspects they meet. So I think that if we are able to look at it from the angle of a patient, then that barrier could come down. But otherwise, I think it's a really time consuming
Mm.
process. And from my experience, for patients, we need to make sure that they are not hassled, they don't feel rushed, they don't feel pushed.
Mhm.
And I think it might be tricky if you're targeting a Congress submission deadline or a journal submission deadline for a rapid publication.
You did speak about some of the benefits of patients being involved as authors, and that does explicitly mean being involved at all stages of the research, right? From conceptualization to publication. Do you think that the industry is more open and welcoming of that in general, and not just the industry, but publication professionals, journals, publishers? Are there things that can be done to make that easier for patients? Are they being done already?
I think there are small steps. We have made progress. Like I said, patients are being invited to contribute at a much earlier stage than previously. And I think it started off with just reviewing materials towards the end, then it became co-developing it. But now I think, it's much, much more involved in terms of how the design of research is going through. But
Mm.
again, it's not the case with all disease areas or all types of research. So I think that's also important to understand. There is more openness depending on the experience of the physician. and depending on the nature of the study and the type of publication. Because, for example, if it's a patient preference study, I think it absolutely falls flat if you don't have the patient voice. If it's, for example, a patient quality of life study, perhaps there's an opportunity there. If they have consulted with patients when they decided which criteria and which questionnaire to use. Very recently, a huge impact was created for multiple myeloma. The FDA, based on a joint research from patient advocacy groups and physicians, cleared a new primary endpoint for clinical trials for multiple myeloma.
Wow.
And there again, it was led and driven by interest from patients who didn't want to wait for the traditional primary endpoints to read out, which could take years. And this again talks about the fact that at the right times, at the right places, the role of patients becomes super important because they provided data, they provided publications, they co-authored those. I think the patient voices definitely are going strong. But then again, it's not all patients. We don't want to include patients for the sake of including them. Also, we don't want to force patients to be involved if they don't want.
I wanted to ask a question just to link back to the topic on access before. If patients are authors, do you believe then that that paper, for whatever reason, might be more accessible to patients? And the reason I'm asking that is, firstly, I'm thinking the patient being involved might mean that there is actually a so what for the patients in there. But also, my assumption is that maybe that patient would be involved in communicating the outputs of that study to patients, being involved in the plain language summary. And therefore, that might make it more accessible to people who want to read that literature.
Absolutely. I think when there is an intent to include a patient as a co-author on a paper, you will see that in most cases, the topic or the content is such that it is intended for a wider audience beyond the scientific community. And then the whole strategy of where to publish, when to publish, and then how do they disseminate that? How do they make it open access? What kind of enhancements like plain language summaries, infographics, videos would go with it? I think it all comes as part of a very concerted approach that this is something that will be targeting patients. We will make everything associated with this paper and the study accessible to patients. And I think that intent definitely is there. So that's what makes it difficult to have the same approach for all clinical studies or say phase 3 studies, which are typically submitted for drug registrations because there's a lot more data and complexity involved. But patient physician perspective publications are coming up a lot where a treating physician and his or her patient talk about their journey together, but it comes from two completely different angles. Then of course the intent is that they would be disseminated to patients and they would learn from it. And then patients, if they are co-authors or if they are involved in the research, the likelihood of them talking to their peers, talking to the community is much, much higher. And we have had an experience of, it's been quite some years now actually, where we had a study in diabetes. It was post-registrational study, which essentially means the drug is in the market, but they wanted to do a larger study just to look at real world effectiveness and safety. And they had a strong partnership with the patient advocacy groups right from the beginning through the whole journey of the study and the publication. And it so turned out that the responses, there was no need to necessarily talk about it a lot, other than just working together in tandem with the patient advocates, who then took that study, talked about it at every conference, at every meeting they attended, and then the paper was published, and then they used that paper to talk about it. It so much so had an impact that eventually it made it into the next guideline update for diabetes the next year. So again, it's very organic. The intention wasn't to go with this with the intent to update the guidelines, but if you find the right balance, I think it works very well.
So we've talked about the industry welcoming patients as co-authors and co-researchers on projects. What about patient-led research that is initiated by a patient group independently? Do you think that the publication system is set up for that, is as welcoming of that? And I want to share my own experience here. So I currently have a paper, which is a patient perspective paper that is under evaluation by a journal at the moment. And what I found quite cool is that the journal was very flexible with the kind of structure I had to follow. It is a perspective piece. So of course, they were very welcoming of more opinions than hard fact. They insisted that it's plain language as much as possible, no jargon, and all of that was great. what I found so crazy and difficult to navigate was that the system would not accept me because I didn't have an institutional affiliation to enter on the system. There were these kind of barriers that should not be there really. So I'm wondering if the publication system is ready for that, where it's not traditional researchers who are submitting papers.
Now, thanks for sharing. It's not just affiliation alone, right? Even when a proper publication is submitted, we struggle with the formatting, we struggle with the referencing style because each journal and publisher have their favorites and they want you to go through that, even though they might reject it on the desk without sending it out. Those are, I think, some of the fallacies that some of the more recent publishers or even some of the established publishers are now opening up to in order to invite more interesting papers because they know they lose out on this a lot. So I think this is definitely worth highlighting to the journal publishers, perhaps through some of the patient organizations you might be involved with, or even through a letter to the editor talking about these challenges, because these are perhaps more administrative challenges rather than the intent to be more inclusive. It's got to do more with how traditionally these interfaces are set up for the use of their editorial desks. And perhaps it just takes a little bit of effort on their side to make it more flexible, because I do see more and more patient authors there who don't have an institutional affiliation. They simply say patient advocate or patient author. In fact, they're tagged as patient authors, and I think that tag also perhaps exists on PubMed because that is also a very important feature through which perhaps other patients might be able to get to papers where they have patients as co-authors. But definitely worth highlighting. Maybe you can invite a publisher guest and can ask them what stops them from making it easy for patient authors.
Great idea. Thanks.
We're definitely happy to push them on that, I think. So this has been a really helpful discussion, and I think I've learned an awful lot so far. So thank you so much, Avishek. What I'd like to know, we've spoken a lot about the current situation and how it's evolved over the last few years, but looking into the future, how do you expect the medical publication space to evolve in the next 5 or so years in the context of both patient access and patient involvement?
I think in terms of access, it's going to get better and better. Since the Open Access Coalition S initiative, things have come a long way, and I think it's only going to go forward from here. So my hope is that open access policies will get better, which will increase accessibility, the readability will increase. The journal publishers are, of course, slowly realizing that their intended audience has expanded beyond the typical academic circles. So I think they are making those efforts. Even the likes of the New England Journal now have quick tech videos and infographics in plain language and easy to follow visuals, which I think is a huge step forward. So accessibility wise, it will get better. I think the full-fledged plain language papers or perspective papers will become more mainstream than the exceptions that they are at the moment. I have also seen efforts, the way the academic poster designs are, which have now become less text heavy and more visual. There are some initiatives from independent teams which are looking at different formats of publications. So my thought is that the way papers look after 5 years might even be different. They might be shorter, they might be more interactive, and I think it all means that the visual digital pieces will make it much more easy for patients to engage with them. In terms of the involvement, I think the regulations, the guidelines need to evolve in terms of what makes them eligible for authorship, what their roles could be. The other aspect which I forgot to mention earlier is also honorarium. It's a taboo because you don't want to come across as pushing payment to patients. But then again, the patient perspective is we are putting in time, effort. So I think that also is something that needs to be looked into. How do we ensure that we value the time that the patients invest in this in the future?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And it's quite an exciting future to imagine where there is more involvement and the ivory tower, as it were, is broken and there is more collaboration on that front. What would you say are your long-term dreams for this space?
As I learn more and more about sociological angles and the biomedical aspects of patient engagement, I would say we need to move away from the tick box exercises and we need to really ask them what they want and not assume what they want. And then we enable those. So I think I'm going to be an advocate who's going to be big on choices to allow for choices to happen where patients want to be involved. then we enable that. I think the lived experience counts a lot. So where is it that we can best benefit from the lived experiences? And that's why you perhaps will see more social media listening studies happening, because what is not getting captured in research sometimes get captured in chat rooms and Facebook groups. So I think that trend will continue, and perhaps that's something we need to make more mainstream. So my hope is that we look at patients as a stakeholder, not the jargon of patient centricity and patient directed and whatnot.
Great. And I'm certainly aligned with that vision as well. And I know that Clarinda would be too. So just to summarize a couple of questions we have about what your advice would be for different stakeholders. So firstly, what would your advice be for patients who are just looking to find a bit more information on their disease so that they can be a bit more informed about their care?
My recommendation always is to find what works for them, right? For patients to be cautious, to look for things, but be cautious, maybe find their own ways of validating information before using it. Not hesitate to ask questions, not hesitate to challenge the healthcare system. I know it's easy for me to say, but I'm doing it as a primary caregiver for my wife at the moment. Sometimes you need to ask the questions to get the right kind of care.
And similarly, what would be your advice for patients who want to get more involved as researchers or publication professionals involved in publications?
I think as researchers, there are these patient advocacy organizations which now have a segment where they create these scientific committees and advisory groups where perhaps it's a good opportunity for patients to express interest, maybe submit a topic. I know there are a lot of grant agencies now which have separate segments which look for patient preference research, and that could be again an option, which then also takes care of the affiliation and also the financing for the study. Another really interesting thing could be some of the agencies and some of the medcoms companies actually create opportunities for patients and those with lived experiences to be part of their teams, to really work on very focused topics, themes of publications, and not just publications, actually medical education programs and other things. And I think that could also be a good opportunity for them to get a flavor of what it is to actually do something like that. At the end of the day, I think there's no fixed rule for every patient. Depending on their motivation, whether they want to do this as a commitment as a patient or they want to do it as a career, I think it all depends on that. And then how much of time they're able to spare, and based on that, they can design with these organizations what works best for them.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because I think we've spoken in previous podcasts as well that if you haven't been involved in research before, it's actually quite difficult as a patient to even know where to go. So it's really helpful that there are lots of different channels that people can use to explore these opportunities. Just as a last piece then, do you have any advice for publication professionals looking to expand patient authorship?
For the journal publishers, I think Clarinda brought it up, right? Just to make it a little bit easy from an administrative standpoint, if someone has a topic, has written up paper, has done research, to make it easier for them to submit and not let logistical issues become barriers. And in terms of study sponsors and others, I think there's been a very quiet movement to get patients involved in different stages. And I think that will continue because there's clearly a benefit for everybody. And the regulators feel more reassured if there is a patient voice and a representation in the designing of the research as well.
Perfect, thank you. I think that's a really positive note to end on, and clearly there is some work that still needs to be done, but we're moving in the right direction, and there are options for patients to find information and also to be involved in communicating, disseminating, being part of research.
Thanks, Avishek. This has been really insightful, informative, and I enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for inviting me. And it did make me think, I enjoyed it, but also it gave me some ideas on what I could do next. So thanks for making that happen.
So, Caitlin, how about you and I just break that down a little bit and summarize some of the top things that stuck with us through the conversation? So you can go first.
Yeah, so I think overall the first kind of positive thing is that more people have the opportunity to look for information on their disease. And I think that is really important for those who want to, that they can access that information and then they can use that to sort of build their own confidence and have conversations with their doctor about their disease and treatment plan. And that's really important for shared decision making, which I know we discussed with Victor on our last episode.
Yeah.
So I think that's a positive direction.
Yeah, I agree. And it's heartening that patients are looking to understand the research more,
Mhm.
and there are lots of initiatives underway for them to access that information better. The conundrum, though, is that it can also lead to an overwhelm and a difficulty in identifying what is reliable.
Mhm.
While tools like ChatGPT are definitely going to help, and there's a lot of promise there. Again, I think the point that Avishek made about not just trusting a single source, but looking at multiple sources for a single piece of information, I think that that's a really good tip that patients should apply.
Mhm. Yeah, agree. And I think what we spoke about in this episode was how patients can better access that really reliable information in medical journals. And obviously, that is really reliable. It's peer reviewed and it's got very stringent, statistically tested data in it.
Mhm.
But it is not written for patients, is the problem.
Yeah.
And there are 2 points to that. So maybe that data isn't actually relevant to the patients,
Mhm.
but where it is, how can they access it? And luckily, there's some good initiatives to allow patients to get access to that. So one is the Open Access Initiative, which means that any member of the public can access papers in some cases, rather than having to pay a journal to get access to.
Mhm.
And the second one is about plain language summaries, which helps people to read sort of a lay-facing summary of that paper.
Yeah.
There are also sites like Cochrane who provide plain language summaries.
Right.
You could also get an AI to produce them, but that isn't always the most reliable.
Yeah, and I think that one really important tool to making literature more patient focused and more reliable is to have patients on as authors.
Mhm.
And I've been lucky to be a patient author. And since our conversation with Abhishek, my paper has now been published, and there's a link in the notes. But my experience doing that has kind of taught me how important it is for patients to have a voice in these publications, but also that there's room for the system to be a little more friendly and
Mhm.
for some of those standards and processes to change as needed to accommodate patients who are not trained researchers, but who do have a very important and valuable perspective to bring.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I think it's so cool that you achieved that, and I'm really proud of you. And I really hope that this leads the way for more people to be patient authors and more journals making it easier for that to happen.
Yes, I hope so too.
Thanks so much for listening. This has been Not Just Patients with our guest Avishek Pal and your hosts Caitlin Rich and Clarinda Cerejo.